Tonight we're going to continue our study of Psalms. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Psalm 75, we'll be continuing in this study. Psalm 75 is set during the destruction of the Assyrian army, or the destruction of the Assyrian army under Sennacherib when they had laid siege to Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. And by the beginning of the 7th century BC, Assyria ruled just virtually all of the known world at that time. The inhabited, what we would call the modern world, was under Syrian control. Had been in varying degrees for over 3 centuries before its fall. And they subjected their victims through intimidation and various kinds of unconscionable, vicious brute force that they would inflict on them. In fact, an oft-repeated statement when the kings would have their reliefs and they would make their decrees, an oft-repeated statement would be, "I destroyed, devastated, and burned with fire." And wherever they went, that's what they were known for. People would oftentimes come out and surrender before the Assyrians even got to their gates. Oftentimes, even in that surrender, they would take the nobles of the city and make examples of them before the inhabitants. There was one king, Ashurbanipal II, that he ruled from 883 to 859, and he said this in his chronicle: "I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls. I burned their adolescent boys and girls. A pillar of heads I erected in front of the city." And this whole thing of flaying, skinning people, oftentimes alive, decapitation, dismemberment, these were their favorite means to show force. And here is a relief that actually shows a man being flayed alive. And that was the unspeakable intimidation that they brought whenever they came upon a person. So you can imagine they had already conquered the northern kingdom over a century earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel. They had conquered all of Judah. It was only the city of Jerusalem, basically, that had withstood them. And they had laid siege to Jerusalem. And the people were sure that their days were numbered. Many of Hezekiah's subjects were begging him to surrender because they wanted to, they knew what the alternative would be. And this is a psalm that was written during that time when the Lord miraculously saved the inhabitants of Jerusalem by his angel. It's a psalm of Asaph. And it says, "We give thanks to you, O God, we give thanks for your wondrous works. Declare that your name is near." Now, where it says that your name is near, that's probably a Hebrewism for saying your presence. You know, the Hebrews had kind of a hard time picturing an omnipresent God being in a particular place. And so oftentimes when they would write about God being here or there, they would substitute something for God because they're thinking, well, God can't be here, he's everywhere. So he can't be there, he's everywhere. And so they would say, well, his name is there. Or sometimes they would even say his presence. And so his omnipresence made it difficult for them to speak of God being in any particular place. He says, when I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly. Now, we have a system of government today. We have what is called a justice system in America that many would say is neither. You know, it's neither just nor is it a system. But at least there would be many people that would challenge that it's at the very least is an oxymoron. You know, like we got military intelligence and jumbo shrimp. You understand what an oxymoron is. My 2 words that don't go together. My 2 favorite ones, of course, are NIV Study Bible and country music. Those would be, I think, the probably primary oxymorons. But justice system in many people's minds would fall under that category of being an oxymoron. Because the reality is that in America, it's the man with the most money comes up with the best lawyer, and he gets to skate the easiest. And yet we've got the best system on earth. We've got the best legal system that has ever been. And when man has been in charge of justice since the Garden of Eden, he has miserably failed. And God is saying, I will bring justice when I choose the right time. When I make the declaration that it's time, I will judge uprightly. The earth and all its inhabitants are dissolved, and I set its pillars firmly. Think about that, he says. Just Selah. I'm in charge. I said to the boastful, do not deal boastfully, and to the wicked, do not lift up the horn. You know, a horn on an animal is a sign of strength. You know, that's an animal's, a horned animal, it's their primary weapon, is their horn. And so the horn became a symbol of strength, metaphorically. And he says, so don't lift up your horn. In other words, don't rattle your sabers, don't pump your guns, don't act like you're going to be somebody around me. Don't lift up your horn on high, and don't speak with a stiff neck. The NLT says it this way, it says, don't raise your fist in defiance at the heavens. And that's what God is saying. He's warning these Assyrians who have laid siege to Jerusalem. He's basically saying, you guys better back off, because you're not going to like the consequences. Lifting up your horn was a sign of obstinance. And he says, you don't want to do that to me. For exaltation, he says in verse 6, a well-known King James translation is for promotion, comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. You know, it's a word that typically would be if you're going to give somebody honor. If it's going to be somebody who is going to be lifted up, exalted in some way. And God is saying to the Assyrians, this exaltation, this promotion, doesn't come from the east, it doesn't come from the west, nor does it come from the south. And it's saying it that way because the biblical direction to heaven is north. This is why maps today are oriented with the north being up. In those days, they didn't think of it in those kind of terms, but they always thought of north being the direction toward heaven. And, you know, he says, when the proper time comes, when I choose the proper time, I'm going to make things right. I'm going to bring justice and judgment. And until then, don't be thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think, because I'm going to bring it down when I'm ready to bring it down. And we know that. We know that God is in charge. We know that he calls us to be patient as we wait for his will to sometimes be realized in our lives. But waiting can be a killer, can it? I mean, it can sometimes be very hard to wait, even though we know what the outcome is going to be. I mean, how hard it must have been for David, you know, when he had been anointed as a young boy, even between 12 and 13 years old, and he had been anointed to be the next king, and yet he had to wait 20 years before he was able to see that realized. And that would have been, I mean, he had been called, he had been anointed, and he was told that he would be king, and yet he had to wait all through his teen years, all through his 20s, and you can imagine how hard that would have been. Not only did he have to wait, I mean, just waiting is hard enough, but in that waiting, he had to undergo such terrible hardships, horrendous difficulty in the process of waiting. Why? I mean, why didn't God just wait until he was 29 and then anoint him as being king? Why did he do it at such a young age and then make him wait as he was undergoing all of this hardship under the heavy thumb of Saul? You know, maybe the Lord was maturing David and teaching him lessons of faith. Maybe the faith on waiting when he knew what was ahead but had to wait for it patiently and peacefully. Maybe he had to learn those lessons. Maybe it didn't have anything to do with David. Maybe it was all about he was filling up the iniquity of Saul and Saul's rebellion against him. Maybe that's what it was. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Don't know. But we do know that David was content. We read in his Psalms how he was content to wait for God's promotion. And he says in verse 7, Asaph tells us, but God is the judge. You know, don't lift up your horn. Don't shake your fist at heaven. Don't act like you're somebody when you're not, because God is the judge. And he puts down one and he exalts another. Remember what Jesus said when he was talking about if somebody wants to be great in his kingdom, to learn to be the servant of all. And he says in Matthew 23:12, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And I think this is what the psalmist has in mind here. And then he tells us in verse 8, for in the hand of the Lord there is a cup, and the wine is red, and it's fully mixed, and he pours it out, and surely its dregs shall all the wicked of the earth drain and drink down. You know, there's a cup of God's judgment. There's a cup of God's wrath against sin that is already poured in, the wine is already poured into the cup. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 12, we read about those that will, in this future, soon coming, I believe, future time, when people will be challenged to either take the mark of the beast, to receive his mark, or to resist it. And those that take the mark, he says in Revelation chapter 14, verses 9 and 10, then the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. This is the cup of God's indignation. This is the wine of his judgment. And it's going to be poured out and drunk by the inhabitants of the earth that reject Jesus. It's actually, though, I believe we could say metaphorically, we know this is not a literal cup of sauce, but metaphorically it's the very same cup that was drank 2,000 years ago. Remember when Jesus was in the garden and he was sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. And he cried out to the Lord and he said, Lord, if there's any other way, I know what you've called me to. And I know what's about to happen. I know that I'm about to bear the sins of the world, and I'm about to be the brunt of your wrath against sin. But if there's any other way, could you let this cup pass from me? Could we go back to the drawing board and see if possibly there might be a plan B? But then he ends the prayer by saying, but nevertheless, not your will, but mine. And so he drank that cup of God's wrath, that cup of God's judgment against sin. He drank it down, as the psalmist says here, even to the very dregs. And because of that, God's wrath was satisfied fully. God's judgment against sin was fully, the Bible guy term is expiated, fully satisfied in Jesus. And the result of that is, because it was so fully satisfied in Jesus, that we have a complete access before his throne even today. And so the psalmist says in verse 9, but I will declare forever, and I will sing the praises to the God of Jacob. All the horns of the wicked I also cut off, but the horns of the righteous shall be exalted. Now the theme of Psalm 76 is that Jehovah, Yahweh, is our victory. And it's we've seen this 6 other times where it says it's written on stringed instruments, or in the Old King James they just transliterate it. It's the word neganoth, and this is the last of 6 of those. But this is one that's a Psalm of David, and they just tell us it's a song. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. You know, Judah and Israel, after the nations divided following the death of Solomon, when Jeroboam and Rehoboam split the country in two, Judah and Israel became, as it were, the 2 denominations of Judaism. They were the 2 different belief systems. They both thought that the other one was wrong and that they were right. They both thought that they were the chosen of God. And yet the reality is that in elements they both were the chosen of God, and in elements they were both very wrong. And the psalmist acknowledges here that God is known in Judah, and his name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tabernacle, and his dwelling place is in Zion. Salem is just a shortened form of Jerusalem. It was originally called Salem in the book of Genesis. And so his tabernacle is there in Jerusalem, psalmist is saying. Of course, that's where the temple was built. And Zion is his dwelling place. Now, Zion is another name for Jerusalem. It's actually one of the hills in Jerusalem. Some people think that it's another name for the Temple Mount, but actually Zion is across the valley, across the Hinnom Valley from Mount Moriah. But it became a synonym, especially biblically. It's another name for God's holy city. And his dwelling place, he says, that's the place where I'm going to choose to place my name. And there he broke the arrows of the bow and the shield and the sword of battle, just as he did with the Assyrians. You know, he says he broke the arrows of the bow. It's like the Assyrians would pull out their bow, and then they would grab an arrow, and they'd put it in the string, and they would draw it back. And just as they were sighting down the arrow and getting ready to release it, the bowstring breaks. And the arrow just falls right there in their hands, useless. He says, there he broke, there in Jerusalem, when the Assyrians had the city surrounded, laid siege to it, he broke their arrows. And then Asaph tells us, think about that. Right when it looked like all hope was over, right when it looked like the Assyrians were going to come and they were going to completely gain victory, that's when he says Selah. The word tabernacle that's used up in verse 3 is not the normal word for tabernacle. It's not the word that means tent. In fact, in other places in the Bible, it's translated by the word lair, like a animal's lair in Jeremiah 25, or den in Psalm 10, verse 9. And it's like this is not the when it says it's the dwelling places, or Jerusalem is his tabernacle. That's what that means, is that's where God hunkers down. You know, that's where God dwells. That's his lair, his den. So think about that, the psalmist tells us. Spurgeon, as he comments on this Selah, and if you're new tonight, you know that I have been very unapologetically ripping off Spurgeon all the way through our time in Psalms, and I'll continue to do it until we get to 150, because this was definitely his magnum opus, his commentary on the book of Psalms. But he says, in the spiritual conflicts of this and every age, the like will be seen. No weapon that is formed against the church shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against her in judgment she shall condemn. Selah. Think about that. It is meet, meaning it's kind of archaic word for it is necessary. It is meet that we should dwell on so soul-stirring a theme and give the Lord our grateful adoration. Hence, a pause is inserted. You know, as he says that the enemy is going to come against you, and just when it seems like he's going to break through, he's going to break their arrows. Pause. You know, stop and think about that. Let the reality of that, that Jesus says that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Now, sometimes we think of the fact that, you know, the gates of the city, the gates of the church are going to be protected against the onslaughts of the enemy. And the enemy is going to come and he's going to assail our gates, but we're going to be well protected. And this is true, but that's not what Jesus said. He said the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. That we will be the one who dominate because of Christ's victory. And so the psalmist says in verse 4, you are more glorious and excellent than the mountains of prey. The stout-hearted were plundered. They have sunk into their sleep. None of the mighty men have found the use of their hands. And at your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both the chariot and the horse were cast into a deep sleep. You know, the Assyrians had surrounded Jerusalem on all the hills around, and they had laid siege for some time. Rabshakeh, the general of Sennacherib's army, had come down and made tremendous threats. He even said at one point, he said, I'll tell you what, we'll provide the horses if you can just, to field a Calvary, if you can just get men to ride them. You know, we'll help you guys fight us if you think you can stand against us. Nobody else has. Nobody else has been able to give us a go, so why don't you just surrender right now? And the people were scared. And you've heard me laughingly, jokingly say many times that night the Assyrians went to bed, and that night 185,000 Syrians woke up dead. And you think, well, I'm just being silly. But it says here they didn't wake up dead, they went to sleep dead. You know, they were cast into a deep sleep. I guess God anesthetized them before he sent the death angel in to kill them. The Assyrians were so fearsome. The people were so afraid of them. One of the things that they would do in their chariots is they would put these big blade-like scythes on the hubs of their chariots. And so when they would go into an infantry, they would just chop their legs off. And this was the sort of thing that the people were afraid of facing when the Assyrians came. And Asaph is telling us here in commemoration, I think. He's looking back on this, whoever this guy with the title Asaph is, of how faithful God was in a time of trial. You yourself, he says in verse 7, are to be feared, and who may stand in your presence when once you are angry. You know, he says, who is it that thinks that they can stand in your presence, God, when you're mad? Probably, and maybe not, maybe inarguably, the greatest post-Bible sermon that was ever preached. Most guys would agree that it was done by Jonathan Edwards, and it was a little work by the title of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God that he preached back in Enfield, Connecticut many years ago. And let me just share, if I might, a short excerpt from, or a couple of excerpts from this sermon. Now, Jonathan Edwards was very nearsighted, and they said that when he actually wrote his sermons out verbatim, and he would read them, but he was so nearsighted he had to hold them up in front of his face like this. And he spoke in a very dry, monotone voice. And yet thousands would become converted at his meetings. And this is what Johnny tells us about what it's like to be a sinner in the hands of an angry God. Unconverted men walk over a pit of hell on rotten covering. And there are innumerable places in this covering so weak that they will not bear their weight. And these places are not seen. Your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf. And your healthy constitution, your own care and prudence and best contrivance, and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and to keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. It's a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire of wrath, that you are held over in the hand of that God whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it, both to and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator, and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you have ever done, nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you one moment. And he goes on for 45 minutes almost. And it said that many people, as he was delivering this sermon, they would actually cry out for salvation even in the middle of the sermon. They couldn't even wait for the altar call. What would it be like to think that somebody could stand in the presence of an angry God? It makes our knees smote to get one against the other. But then, what makes us think that somebody could stand in the presence of a happy God? What makes us think that we could stand in God regardless of what his mood is? That if anybody thinks that they have the right to stand before God without even checking whether he's got out on the wrong side of the bed or not. No one. And yet in Jesus, because Jesus' sacrifice was so complete, because when he said it is finished, he meant it, and it was so totally and completely finished, because God's judgment against sin is so fully satisfied, because that cup was drunk all the way down to its dregs. In Jesus, we have full access. In Jesus, we don't have to worry about what kind of mood God's in. We are fully accepted in the beloved. In Jesus, we can go before him anytime, day or night, and know that he will completely embrace us. It's uninhibited, it's unlimited, and it's unfettered. You cause judgment to be heard from heaven, he says in verse 8. The earth feared and was still when God arose to judgment to deliver the oppressed of the earth. Selah. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you, and with the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself. Make vows to the Lord your God and pay them. We don't really think much about vows today, making vows today. And it's primarily because by the time of, it was a biblical thing. I mean, the Levitical law talked about making vows. There was a whole system laid out about what you should do when you vowed and what happened if you didn't and so forth. And by the time of Jesus, it had become so trivialized because the Jewish leadership had found so many different ways of getting around their vows and found so many loopholes in the man-made system that it just had become a farce. And so Jesus says in the Gospels, he says, don't vow. Don't say I swear by my mother's grave or by the hair of my chinny chin chin or anything like that. Just don't swear that you'll do it, just do it. And if you're not going to do it, then say you're not going to do it. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. But vowing is a biblical thing. I mean, it is talked about in the Bible. And the psalmist here says, make vows to the Lord and then pay them. Spurgeon, he explains it this way. He says, to vow or not is a matter of choice, but to discharge our vows is our bounden duty. He who would defraud God is his own God is a wretch indeed. He keeps his promises. Let not his people fail in theirs. He is their faithful God and deserves to have a faithful people. And then he goes on to say, and let all who are around him bring presents to him who ought to be feared. He shall cut off the spirit of princes, and he is awesome to the kings of the earth. Psalm 77, I think we could say, is a prescription for depression. It's a psalm that, if heeded, I think would be a sure cure for depression. And it's addressed to Jeduthun. We've seen that before, and it's another psalm of Asaph. And the psalmist says, I cried out to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. There are some basic truths that are so basic they almost seem childish for us to repeat, for us to state, but we need to repeat them, we need to state them because we need to be reminded of them, because we oftentimes forget them, because sometimes we think that they're not true. For example, God is good. We were talking about this last Sunday, and we need to say that. We need to remind ourselves of that because sometimes life kind of would tell us otherwise. God is all-powerful. God is all-wise. And we know this, and for us to repeat it sometimes sounds kind of elementary, but the reason is because sometimes life would tell us otherwise, and there's another basic truth that I think is good for us to repeat. And that is that God answers prayer. Now, we all know that, and if I were to do a survey, how many of you think God answers prayer, I would think that on a Wednesday night homeboy service, we would get 100% response in the positive. Yet, sometimes we wonder about that, don't we? Sometimes we pray, and the prayer doesn't get answered, and it was a good prayer, and so it had to be God's will because it was a good prayer, and God's will is always good, and so why didn't he answer it? There are times when sometimes it seems like it's not. So it's good for us. This is a basic truth that we need to remind ourselves. And this is what the psalmist is saying. He's starting off, I cried out to God, and he heard me. He gave an ear to me. And then he says in verse 2, in the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. Now, if you got the old King James where he says, I stretched out my hand, old King James says, they stretched out my sore. And I have no idea why it says that. I mean, it's not a language thing. It's not a textual thing. It's not an archaic thing or anything like that. No other translation does it that way except for the Message. And I don't know why he did it that way. But it's his hand that was stretched, not his sore. He didn't say, God, look at this ooze I have here. Do something. It's just, he stretched out his hand day and night. And he says, and I remembered God, and I was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. Don't know what was going on in Asaph's life here. And I think it's purposeful that we don't. I think it was the Holy Spirit omitted that part for our benefit. Asaph had cried out to the Lord, and he was going through something that was really beating him down. And he was trying very hard. He was trying with every fiber of his being to bring every thought captive. He was trying to think on the things that were true and that were pure and that were good and noble. He was trying to think about the things of Jesus. He was trying very much to remember God. He knew it was right. He knew that God was true and that God was steadfast and that God would answer prayer. But in the midst of this, whatever it was he was going through, he was feeling so overwhelmed that he didn't even think he could pull it together. He didn't think that he would be able to just stand on that very simple, basic truth that God answers prayer. Have you ever been there? I mean, can you relate to what Asaph is saying? I remembered God and was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. And as he's trying to get it together, as he's trying to bring every thought captive, he says, Selah. Just stop. Exhale. Think about it. And as he's trying to process in his mind, he says in verse 4, you hold my eyelids open. You know, I mean, it's like God's going like this with Asaph. He can't even catch a nap. Can't even get rest. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I've considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. And so as he's processing this, as he's pausing and thinking about it, as he's selahing through this moment, he says, I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search. And then he asks himself a series of questions here. And he says, will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promise failed evermore? Or in the Old King James it says, has his mercy clean gone forever? You know, God's mercy is just clean gone. Or is it? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has his anger shut up his tender mercies? And it just, I mean, even the thought of that, you know, that's a very scary thought, that God could be so mad at me that he would no longer be merciful. The promise that his mercies would be new every morning, just not going to be true anymore. Because I've crossed some line. I've said no to him one too many times. I have hardened myself just a little bit too far to think that God would just not even be wanting to extend mercy to me. That's a very scary thought. And so Asaph, as he's contemplating that, he says, Selah. Think about that. But the reality is, as we go back to these questions, you know, as he's trying to process this, and he's trying to bring this all into, trying to make sense of a very unsensible situation, and he asks himself these series of questions, but they're all rhetorical questions. You know, he doesn't need the answer to them. Will God cast off forever? Well, of course not. Will he be favorable no more? Oh, no. That's his nature. He's God. He loves. Will his mercy be ceased forever? No, he's a merciful God. That can't be true. No. These are rhetorical questions. Has his promise failed forevermore? No. Has God forgotten to be gracious? Well, of course not. Has he shut up his tender mercies in the midst of his anger? And Asaph, just as he's processing this and thinking it through, he's going, no, of course it's not true. And so he says in verse 10, and I said, this is my anguish, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. So what Asaph is doing with this, as he says, I've cried out to God, and I'm not hearing nothing. I've asked for him to come minister to this need, and I'm not sensing that appearing. What am I to do with this? Has God forgotten me? Has God set me aside? As he's trying to process something that was overwhelming to him, he came to the conclusion that the problem here is me. It's not God. That's another basic truth. And I need to remember that. I need to hold on to that. And he's making the volitional decision right here. He says, somewhere in this process, somewhere in this trial that I'm going through right now, somewhere in this very overwhelming circumstance, I made the choice to allow the circumstance to take my eyes off God and put them on the circumstance. Whether I listened to the enemy or whether I was just victim of my own flesh, or both. It doesn't matter, because I made the volitional choice to take my eyes off God and put him on the circumstance. And so what Asaph is doing now is he's saying, I'm going to exercise that same volition now to take my eyes off my circumstance and put them back on the Lord. When he says, this is my anguish, he's not saying that this thing that happened to me is necessarily my fault. He's not saying that I'm going through this because of my failure. But what he is saying, it may be the circumstances weren't his fault, but what he considered that what he did with them was his responsibility. And he said, I might not be able to do anything about my circumstances, but I can do something about how I respond to them. And so he makes the choice. He makes the volitional choice to take his eyes back off of whatever this trial was and put him back on the author and finisher of his faith. And he says in verse 11, I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember. He would have heard as a child about how God had delivered them from the Egyptians and all the miracles that, he said, oh God, you parted the Red Sea. As he says here, the water saw you, O God, the water saw you, and they were afraid. The depths also trembled. When the Israelites came up against the Red Sea, and there was the Egyptian army behind them and the Red Sea in front of them, and the Israelites didn't like armies, and they certainly didn't like seas. They didn't go into swimming. And yet God delivered them from that. He parted the Red Sea so that they walked across on dry land. And he said, then you caused the water to fall back over the Egyptian army and you drowned them. And then you caused water to come out of the rock so that the children of Israel could drink. And you provided manna for them every day so that they had sustenance for their bodies. Their shoes never wore out. Their clothes never wore out. You protected them from disease the whole time they were in the desert. You gave them everything that they needed, and you provided for it miraculously. Oh, God. And I'm thinking that you can't handle this thing I'm going through right now. I'm thinking that somehow you've forgotten how to get it done. He says in verse 17, the clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound, your arrows also flashed about, probably talking about lightning and thunder. And the voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, your paths in the great waters. Your footsteps were not known. You led your people like a flock by the hands of Moses and Aaron. He said, your footsteps were not known. It seems to me that God's footsteps were known. It seems to me that it was very evident that this was the hand of God, that he would have been seen very clearly in all of it. I think what Asaph is saying is that people can deny the miraculous if they want to. It's not like God showed up with a white beard and a big staff and said, here I am, I'm God. They could ignore and deny the miraculous if they want to. They can deny seeing his footprints if they didn't want to see them. But he says, I see that your hand was there and that you provided. And I know that you will provide for this situation that I'm going through right now. Notice that Asaph never comes to the conclusion as to how God is going to provide. He never does dictate to the Lord in what manner this prayer is going to be answered. And he certainly doesn't go into the timing of it. But he comes to the place where he says, God, I'm going to take my hands off. I had forgotten for a minute who was in charge. I had forgotten for just a second. The situation was overwhelming, and please forgive me because I took my eyes off you and put them on it. But I forgot for a minute who was God. And I wanted to tell you how to act. And so I take my hands off of this circumstance. I place it back into your hands, your faithful hands, Lord. And I step back and I trust you for the outcome. And this is the true prayer of faith. You hear people saying today that you need to have faith. You need to pray that prayer of faith. Well, the prayer of faith is the one that takes their hands off of it and places it in God's hands. You know God, I don't. I've heard people say that if you say, if it be your will, that's a faith killer. There's no more faith-filled words that can be uttered than if it be your will. I want your will in this situation. I'll share with you, God, what I would like. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's the way I'd like to see this happen. I'd like to, if you would just indulge me for a minute, it'd be kind of cool if you could unfold it like this. But you decide, not me. Your will, not mine. I'm taking my hands off. And I think when we do that, we can weather every storm. And we will see, once we have weathered, that God was just as faithful in this storm as he was with the children of Israel in the wilderness. Let's pray. God, you are mighty and awesome. We do thank you for the reminder of who you are. That you are all-powerful. That you are fearful. That you are not one to be trifled with. That it would be a foolish man indeed that would want to lift up his horn before you. But we also know that you are good. And that you are merciful. And that you are gracious. We know that you are compassionate. And Lord, that there's not a thing that we go through in this life that doesn't touch you. And that you are affected by the things that affect us to an even greater degree than they affect us. We also acknowledge, Lord, and we declare that we know that you know where we don't. Your ways are not ours. Your paths are greater and higher than ours are. And Lord, you see things from a much better vantage point than we could ever hope for in this life. Thank you for that reminder. Thank you for that assurance. As we offer up the prayer of faith. In the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.